By 2011, Muammar Gaddafi had managed to hang on to power in Libya for over 4 decades. He had dodged coups, shrugged off international sanctions, and survived multiple wars. The man was like political Teflon, but in the last months of his life, that lucky streak finally ran out. Libya descended into chaos, cities turned into war zones, and Gaddafi's ending, not in a golden palace, not in a courtroom with lawyers, but on the ground, beaten, bloodied, and surrounded. Not exactly the retirement plan he had in mind. Muammar Muhammad Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a desert camp near Sirte, Libya. He came from a poor Bedouin family, humble beginnings for someone who would one day make the entire world very, very nervous. As a young man, he joined the military, studying both at home and later in the United Kingdom. Then in 1969, at just 27 years old, he pulled off a bloodless coup against King Idris and took control of Libya. Imagine being 27 and running a country. Most people at that age can barely run their laundry. From then on, Gaddafi ruled Libya with an iron grip. He scrapped the monarchy, shut down US and British military bases, and took over the oil industry. He also invented his own political system, the Jamahiriya, which supposedly handed power to the people. Spoiler alert, it didn't. All the power stayed firmly in Gaddafi's own hands. In the 1970s and 1980s, Gaddafi became infamous worldwide. He was known for radical ideas, a flair for drama, and throwing support behind armed groups overseas. He was accused of funding terror, including the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which killed 270 people. Thanks to that, Libya was slapped with years of heavy sanctions. Gaddafi basically went from world leader to international outcast faster than you can say, bad press. Still, he tried to rebrand himself as a visionary, a pan-African, pan-Arab leader pushing for unity and defiance against the West, and in the 2000s, he actually tried to clean up his image a bit. He gave up weapons programs, reopened ties with Western nations, and started working on Libya's economy. It was like a political makeover montage, from villain to statesman, except most Libyans weren't buying it. Inside the country, resentment brewed. Citizens were tightly controlled. Political parties banned. Freedom of speech didn't exist. Corruption everywhere. Oil money mostly enjoyed by the elite. Meanwhile, Gaddafi and his family lived like royalty, think palaces and private jets, while everyday Libyans struggled. Basically, it was the classic dictator setup. Rules for thee, riches for me. So when protests broke out in February 2011, nobody should have been shocked. In Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city, the unrest came right after uprisings in Tunisia, and Egypt had kicked out their leaders. The whole region was buzzing with rebellion, the Arab Spring. For Libya, it kicked off on February 15th, when families of political prisoners gathered outside a police station, demanding the release of human rights lawyer Fatih Terbal. He had been arrested that same day for exposing the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, where over 1,200 prisoners were executed by Gaddafi's forces. The protest snowballed fast. By February 17th, later dubbed the Day of Rage, thousands of Libyans were in the streets of Benghazi, Beida, Tobruk, and Derna. They were sick of dictatorship, poverty, and repression. But instead of letting people blow off steam, Gaddafi's forces, including the dreaded Internal Security Agency and revolutionary committees, opened fire. Hospitals reported over 230 deaths in just 4 days. Gaddafi thought he could scare people back into obedience, but as history shows, shooting at an angry crowd rarely makes them less angry. Many protesters were hit in the chest and head, proof that live rounds were being used on people who weren't even armed. Instead of stepping back, Gaddafi's government doubled down, rolling in more troops and sending rooftop snipers to take aim. State TV then tried to spin the whole thing, insisting the protests were the work of foreign agents and drugged youths. Basically, if you didn't agree with Gaddafi, you were either a spy or high. His son, Saif al-Islam, even popped up on TV warning of civil war and promised that rivers of blood would follow if the protests didn't stop. Because nothing says, please calm down, like a horror movie threat. But instead of scaring people off, the crackdown had the opposite effect. By the end of February, parts of the military started switching sides. In Benghazi, soldiers refused to shoot civilians. The 36th Brigade, led by Major General Suleiman Mahmoud, defected and helped rebels seize the city. Soon after, government buildings were torched, police stations were overrun, and armories got raided like supermarkets on Black Friday. By February 24th, eastern Libya had slipped from Gaddafi's hands. Cities like Tobruk, Misrata, Baida and Zawiya saw intense clashes. Protesters armed themselves with rifles looted from bases. Some Libyan pilots decided they weren't bombing anyone. Instead, they flew their planes to Malta and casually asked for asylum. Imagine defecting mid-flight and saying, "Yeah, I quit." The opposition quickly organized under a group called the National Transitional Council, NTC, officially launched in Benghazi on February 27th. It was led by former Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil, who declared they represented the revolution and started sketching out plans for a post-Gaddafi Libya. Basically, they were trying to be the new management before the old boss was even gone. Meanwhile, Gaddafi clung to Tripoli and western strongholds. His forces included the Khamis Brigade, commanded by his son Khamis, stocked with tanks and artillery. To beef up his army, he even brought in foreign fighters from Chad, Mali, and Niger. Nothing screams, "people love me," like having to hire outsiders to keep your own citizens in line. By early March 2011, things had hit a boiling point. Gaddafi's forces unleashed tanks, heavy weapons, and airstrikes to retake rebel cities. Civilians in places like Benghazi and Ajdabiya were under fire. Global media showed shocking footage of entire neighborhoods flattened. Fear spread that if Gaddafi reached Benghazi, the result would be catastrophic. On March 12th, the Arab League held an emergency meeting and called for a no-fly zone over Libya. A big deal, since it gave regional approval for foreign powers to step in. A few days later, France and the UK pushed the United Nations to act. On March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973, with 10 countries in favour and 5 abstentions, Russia and China being the meh, not our problem voters. The resolution gave the green light to use all necessary measures to protect civilians, enforced a no-fly zone, banned military flights, and demanded an immediate ceasefire. 2 days later, on March 19th, things got loud. International airstrikes began, led by the US, France, the UK, Canada, and Italy. The first hits took out Gaddafi's air defences, radar, and military communications. Over 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from US and British ships in the Mediterranean. French jets also destroyed tanks rolling toward Benghazi. The campaign was called Operation Odyssey Dawn, which sounds more like a video game than a military mission, and its goal was clear: stop Gaddafi from pounding civilians, especially in rebel-held areas. On March 23, 2011, NATO officially assumed full control of the Libya intervention under the new banner of Operation Unified Protector. This coalition wasn't just NATO's 28 members, it also pulled in non-member partners such as Qatar, the UAE and Jordan. The alliance quickly went after Gaddafi's military machine. Airstrikes crippled much of his infrastructure. MiG-23s, Sukhoi bombers, and multiple airbases were destroyed. Long-range rocket launchers, supply convoys, and command centers were also wiped out. In just the first couple of weeks, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles were reduced to scrap, especially near Misrata and Zintan. At sea, NATO enforced an arms embargo, with warships patrolling the coast to stop weapons and supplies from reaching loyalist forces. Still, Gaddafi refused to step back. He appeared regularly on state TV, lashing out at NATO for colonizing Libya and branding the rebels as rats and traitors. He promised to purge them city by city. He also accused foreign powers of stealing Libya's oil. His regime tried to retaliate by firing Russian-made surface-to-air missiles at NATO aircraft, but the efforts were futile. The strikes continued, systematically weakening his grip. By mid-2011, momentum on the ground had shifted. NATO's relentless targeting of supply lines and depots left Gaddafi's troops overstretched. Rebel forces from the western mountains, Misrata, and the east began closing in on Tripoli from several directions. On August 20th, the rebels launched Operation Mermaid Dawn, a coordinated assault on the capital. Fighters who had been smuggled into Tripoli weeks earlier rose up inside the city, while armed columns pushed in from outside. The battle raged for 5 days. Districts like Tajura, Fashloom and Souk al-Jumar saw fierce street fighting. Loyalist troops tried to hold out with tanks and snipers but were quickly overrun. Many either surrendered or fled their positions. By August 23rd, the rebels stormed Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's fortified compound and seat of power for over 4 decades. The site was protected by walls, bunkers and tunnels, but it fell after hours of fighting. Inside, rebels found luxury goods, stockpiles of weapons, documents and signs of a rushed departure. But Gaddafi himself was nowhere to be found. Intelligence later revealed he had slipped out before the final battle began, likely on August 19th or 20th. Moving between safe houses under the protection of loyal tribal allies. His family scattered as well. On August 29th, his wife Safia, daughter Aisha and sons Hannibal and Mohammed fled across the Algerian border, where they were granted refuge. Another son, Saadi, later escaped to Niger, where authorities placed him under house arrest. Gaddafi, however, refused to abandon Libya. To him, leaving meant total defeat. Instead, he retreated to territory still loyal to him, particularly around his hometown of Sirte. Sirte, perched on the Mediterranean about 450 kilometers from Tripoli, wasn't just where he was born. It was a city he had heavily developed during his rule. He expanded it with modern roads, government buildings, and even hosted African Union summits there. At one point, he even suggested it become the capital of a United States of Africa. By early September 2011, he had made it back to Sirte with a shrinking circle of supporters, bodyguards, tribal fighters from the Gaddafi, his own tribe, and a few loyal aides. 2 of his sons, Mutassim, a military commander, and Saif al-Islam, his chosen political successor, were also believed to be hiding in and around the city. With Tripoli lost, Sirte became his final stronghold. Isolated, cut off from supplies, and running low on resources, Gaddafi still refused to surrender or leave the country. For him, Libya was the only battlefield left. By the second week of September, the National Transitional Council, NTC, was closing in on Sirte like a very determined group of party crashers. Recognized by many countries as Libya's official government, the NTC sent thousands of fighters from Misrata, Benghazi and Zintan to take the city. Their mission: capture Gaddafi and finally gain full control of the country. They expected a quick victory, but Sirte had other plans. Loyalist forces had turned the city into a veritable fortress. Snipers, artillery units, and all kinds of defensive surprises lurked behind homes, schools, and hospitals. Streets were booby-trapped with landmines and improvised explosives, making a casual stroll around town the stuff of nightmares. By mid-September, the NTC brought out the big guns. Grad rockets, mortars, and tanks turned Sirte into a daily fireworks display, and not the fun kind. NATO planes joined the party, targeting bunkers and command centers. Civilians tried to flee, but many were stuck inside, as the city's infrastructure began collapsing faster than a sandcastle at high tide. Meanwhile, Gaddafi and his crew became masters of hide-and-seek, moving between abandoned homes and underground bunkers to dodge detection. His command structure had gone out the window, morale was low, but he still barked orders to resist. His son Mutassim handled city defenses like a desperate coach trying to rally a losing team. By late September, the NTC had Sirte completely surrounded. The outskirts were under rebel control, and the battle for the city moved block by block, slow, deadly, and littered with casualties. Hundreds of fighters on both sides were killed. NATO drones and surveillance jets hovered overhead, scanning for heat signatures and radio signals like a very persistent neighborhood watch. Gaddafi's crew avoided phones, radios, or anything electronic, relying instead on runners who sprinted messages across the city, basically the world's most dangerous paperboys. Water and electricity were cut off. Food was scarce, mostly limited to canned goods and whatever could be scavenged from damaged stores. Medical supplies were practically non-existent. Wounded fighters were treated with whatever scraps were on hand. Hunger, dehydration, and illness were constant companions. By now, only about 200 fighters remained loyal to Gaddafi, mostly from his own tribe. They formed a protective convoy around him, including longtime Defense Minister Abu Bakr Yunus Jabbar, the last of his inner circle. Gaddafi himself was a shadow of his former self, pale, exhausted, thinner, with a beard gone wild and streaked with white. High blood pressure, mild diabetes, stress, you name it, had caught up with him. But surrender, not an option. Leaving Libya without being dragged out kicking and screaming, also not happening. After Tripoli fell, Gaddafi stopped broadcasting altogether. No more state TV appearances. He feared any slip-up could bring a NATO airstrike down on him. His silence became part of a strategy. Make everyone think he might already be dead, or at least on a very extended vacation somewhere far away. Still, he had a plan. Break through the siege, flee south to Saba, or even cross into Niger, where other loyalists had escaped. But every exit was blocked. Roads were watched. Convoys were attacked or turned back. With no way out, the group became more desperate. They slept in shifts, guarded buildings with sandbags and debris, and hid vehicles from drone view. But the constant bombing made survival a daily test of patience, endurance, and creative ways to dodge rockets. In short, Sirte had become a pressure cooker, and Gaddafi's crew were the last stubborn peas in the pod, hiding, scrambling, and clinging to hope in a city that refused to let them leave quietly. By mid-October, it was obvious even to Gaddafi that Sirte wasn't going to hold out much longer. On October 19th, he decided it was time to make a break for it. That night, he and his inner circle began prepping their escape, essentially a desert road trip with a very heavy, do not mess with us vibe. Their convoy? Over 50 vehicles, mostly pickups and SUVs. Some were armed with machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons, others packed guards and Gaddafi's personal staff, basically a mobile fortress on wheels. Riding along were Muammar Gaddafi, Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, Mansour Dao, chief of security, several senior military officers, and a few lucky family members. The plan was simple in theory. Slip out under the cover of night, no headlights, dodge buildings and trees, and make a break for the desert. Their goal? The outskirts of Sirte, then southwest through Wadi Zamzam to Saba, and maybe a casual escape into Niger or Algeria. Sounds like a straightforward road trip, if your road is mined, full of snipers and under constant drone surveillance. Unsurprisingly, NATO had been playing Big Brother for weeks. American and French intelligence had eyes on the city like hawks, waiting for any suspicious activity. Sure enough, an MQ-1 Predator drone spotted the convoy moving out that night. By the early hours of October 20th, the convoy reached the western outskirts of Sirte, only to be greeted with some very unwelcome attention. Around 8:30 a.m., a US Predator fired a Hellfire missile at the lead vehicle, putting the brakes on that bright idea instantly. Minutes later, French Mirage jets dropped laser-guided bombs on the rear. Boom! Vehicles at both ends were turned into impromptu fireworks displays, leaving the people in the middle frantically trying not to become collateral damage. Gaddafi's guards attempted to retaliate, but it was like bringing water guns to a forest fire. Some vehicles flipped, others crashed while drivers panicked, and dozens of loyalist fighters died instantly. Survivors scrambled toward nearby unfinished buildings, open lots, and a conveniently placed concrete drainage pipe under the road. A very narrow, very dark hotel for desperate despots. Gaddafi, Muammar, Mansour Dao, and a few others survived and crawled into the pipe, about 4 feet wide and hidden by brush and debris. They waited in silence, hoping the rebels would be too distracted to notice them playing hide-and-seek. Meanwhile, rebels from Misrata had been tracking the convoy like a GPS on steroids. They arrived shortly after the strike, armed with rifles, grenades, and light machine guns, and began a thorough search. Blood stains and footprints led them straight to the pipe. A grenade was tossed in as a polite warning, and then they discovered Gaddafi, looking like he'd just lost a very bad fight with a blender. Brown pants, blood-stained shirt, flak vest, matted hair, face covered in dirt and blood, and injuries to multiple limbs. Not exactly the confident dictator the world had seen on TV. They dragged him into the sunlight, barely able to walk. Muammar, also wounded but still standing, and Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, badly injured, were captured moments later. Others who tried to escape were either shot or rounded up on the spot. Mansour Dao confirmed later that they had been heading to Saba when the airstrike crashed their road trip. Rebels tossed Gaddafi into the back of a pickup truck. As word of his capture spread, a crowd gathered. And then, let's just say, the welcome committee got very creative. Sticks, fists, gun butts, hair pulling, clothing tugging, and plenty of shouting. Years of dictatorship, torture, and bombing grievances were vented all at once, a very messy, very satisfying version of crowd therapy. A few fighters clambered into the back of the truck to get a closer look at Gaddafi, and, honestly, chaos ruled the scene. Several videos later went viral, showing him slumped over, bleeding heavily from his head and midsection. At one point, he tried to sit up, but nope, not happening. The beating continued for several minutes as the truck slowly navigated narrow streets packed with armed fighters, like a nightmare parade on wheels. Exactly when he died? That's still a mystery. Medical reports show he had been shot in the head and abdomen. Some say it happened during a scuffle in the truck. Others argue someone may have pulled the trigger on purpose. There was no trial, no formal execution, and certainly no "please hold for your turn" announcement. All anyone knows is that by the time the truck reached an NTC checkpoint on Sirte's outskirts, Muammar Gaddafi was very much definitively dead. His body was battered, bloody, and bruised, shirt torn, pants soaked, looking less like a dictator and more like a piñata after a very angry party. His remains were taken to Misrata, a city that had endured enough suffering to last a lifetime. For 3 days, they kept him in a refrigerated meat locker at a local market under the watch of the city's militia. Hundreds of people lined up to see him, snapping photos and recording videos, because nothing says history lesson like a dictator on ice. For some it was closure, for others sweet revenge served cold. Muammar Gaddafi and Abu Bakr Yunus Jabba also ended up in Misrata, both dead shortly after capture, Muammar from gunshot wounds and Jabba from injuries sustained during the convoy disaster. By October 23rd, just 3 days later, the NTC declared the civil war officially over. After 8 grueling months and over 30,000 deaths, Libya finally had new leadership. Once the public viewings wrapped, the question of Gaddafi's final resting place came up. On the night of October 25th, 2011, he was buried in a remote desert spot somewhere in western Libya. To this day, the exact location remains a secret, because even in death, he managed to be mysterious. Gaddafi's violent end mirrored his rule. Chaotic, bloody, and utterly unceremonious. And while many questions lingered, who fired the final shot? Why wasn't there a trial? Could it have gone differently? For most Libyans, none of that mattered. His death was the end of an era, and for once, the people calling the shots had the last laugh.